Welcome to Talk World Radio, a half-hour discussion of politics as if the people mattered. I'm David Swanson. This week on Talk World Radio, we are talking about the collapse of societies with the author of one of the best books I have read in a long time. I used the word read to cover having listened to the audiobook, which is what I actually did. The book is called Goliath's Curse. The author is Luke Kemp, who is also a research affiliate and former research associate at the Center for the Study of Existential Risk at the University of Cambridge. I hope I got that right. Luke Kemp, welcome to Talk World Radio.
David, thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on. Thanks very much for writing this book, Goliath's Curse. Maybe we should start with what is a Goliath?
Just by the way, I have a cat meowing in the background, unfortunately, so don't let it deter you.
You can hear that, but I don't think we can.
No worries. A Goliath is a set of dominance hierarchies, essentially a situation, a social blueprint in which an individual or small group, sorry, I'll
Humans,
restart
not
that
cats.
actually. Yeah, I'm cat sitting for a friend, and they're very friendly. I'll restart from the top. A Goliath is a set of dominance hierarchies, a social blueprint in which an individual or a small group essentially is ranked above others and uses that through force to take resources and energy. It's the blueprint we're most used to. It's empires, kingdoms, and it's what's dominated the last 5,000 years of human history, but it's also very different to how we've evolved. For the first 300,000 years of human history, we were egalitarian and we didn't exist in dominance hierarchies. And a Goliath is not just an empire, it's a collection of these. So the Roman Goliath was not just the Roman Empire, it was also the distinction between slave and master, rich and poor, and man and woman. Goliaths are what collapse, and Goliaths are what people are usually referring to when they think of civilization.
So when we look at the hierarchies and authoritarian societies and warmongering of today, and people excuse it to me as, well, it's just human nature, apart from the fact that they can never define what that means, it's at odds with most of the existence of humanity as far as we know, right?
Precisely. So this idea of it's human nature to exist in autocracies, to exist in lopsided and equal societies is completely and utterly wrong. It's usually based upon more or less the view of the 17th century philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who had this perspective that humans were incredibly bad at coordinating and cooperating, were constantly trying to kill each other, and that life without a king, without an overarching authority, was a struggle, that it was marked by lives which were nasty, brutish, and short. When you actually look at the archaeological record and you look at studies of nomadic egalitarian hunter-gatherers, that's not remotely true. Hobbes, when he made this up, was essentially making it up. He made a list of different assumptions about how people act, their psychology, and then project that into the deep past. But when we look into the deep past, it's quite clear that we're actually very pro-social. We, as far as we can tell, existed in quite large societies, so maybe in bands of 20 to 200 people, but people would have known thousands of individuals across their lifetime because they were constantly moving across groups. And we traded all the way from the east coast to the west coast of Africa, roughly 140,000 years ago. And additionally, there's very few signs of violence. The best both genetic evidence and skeletal analyses all suggest that violence is probably only 1 to 2%. So out of every 100 people born, only roughly one or two would have died at the hands of a human. And we see this when collapse actually occurs. In modern day studies of what's called disaster risk, so things like hurricanes, terrorist attacks, earthquakes, generally speaking, people tend to behave quite pro-socially, altruistically, and are very good at cooperating and essentially self-organizing. To the extent that people across the field now agree that the idea of mass panic is a myth. It's more or less built upon this false assumption about human nature. What is true, of course, is that we do eventually get autocracies. We do eventually get these big Goliaths, but they're not really civilized per se. When you look across the world, the very first Goliaths are marked by things like mass human sacrifice, every single one's preceded by warfare, and of course, things like patriarchy and slavery.
you use the word Goliath in a similar way to how some people, I think, use the word civilization, but one has a negative connotation, and the other, still, I think, for most people, a positive connotation. But you look at the growth and the collapse of these things, and the collapse is always assumed to be a negative event, not entirely accurate, right?
Exactly. The book is an attempt to look at history through the lens of the 99% rather than the 1%. And we do tend to look at history through the 1%, which is natural. Most writers throughout history have been employed by kings or the rich. And most of the artifacts we can easily see, whether it be temples, ziggurats, pyramids, palaces, they're easy to find. They look cool, but they're not exactly where most people lived. Even at the very height of the Western Roman Empire, over 90% of the population lived on farms. And when you actually look at how it was to live for the average person in empire and how they experienced collapse, suddenly history starts to look very different. For instance, the collapse of Western Empire, directly afterwards, people seem to grow taller and healthier. So height's a good overall indicator of biophysical health. And people do get taller afterwards. And people also have less what's called bone lesions, trauma on the bones, and less dental cavities, less holes in their teeth, which suggests they were having more exercise, less disease, and basically more calories, more protein. The natural retort here is, but Luke, so many people died and so many people had to move that, of course, the survivors had more resources. Which sounds cool, but it's not really true. When we look at Rome, even at its very height, people who lived outside the empire were also taller and healthier. The old trope of the muscle-bound Germanic barbarian is kind of true. And even the rise of Rome actually seemed to have been not a great thing for its citizens. According to some projections, people were 8 centimeters taller, sorry, 8 centimeters shorter than they should have been, according to projections prior to the rise of Rome. In short, empires often weren't good for your health, and their collapse often could be good for people. That's not to say that collapse is always a good thing or didn't have its costs. It often was accompanied by a spasm of violence, for instance, and often things like famine and disease in some cases. But not all collapses are the same, and many collapses were a boon for most people.
And you looked at a huge number of these collapses, a huge pile of data. Not you didn't just pick out a few examples, right?
Exactly. So the book is an attempt to, rather than cherry pick, to take the widest, deepest lens possible. In this case, I make ample use of both what's called the Seshat database, which is the largest historical information database in the world, being curated by both Dan Hoyer, a colleague of mine, a historian, and Peter Turchin, who's another historian renowned for his work on what's called structural demographic theory, essentially how societies go through periodic crises. Alongside that, I made my own database called Moros, the Mortality of States Index, which is based upon, or named after the Greek god of doom, where essentially I try to take all the best estimates of when different states both began and terminated across human history, how they terminated, so whether it was a collapse or not, and what's the best theories we have for their termination. And I use those as well as a huge number of other sources to basically try to provide a look across not just a couple of hand-picked societies, like in the case of Jared Diamond, who uses five, three of which are islands. Instead, I'd look across roughly 428.
Yeah, better data. And what do you find in terms of the characteristics that make collapse more likely?
A few things. One is that we did a statistical analysis, which found that it does seem that most states are more likely to collapse after roughly 200 years or so. They seem to basically become more likely to collapse as time goes on. They age in a way. And then essentially they get to roughly 200 years and they stay at a kind of like maximum level of risk. So it's kind of like a human body. You get older and older. As you get older, your risk of dying increases. Then eventually you get to a pretty high level of risk and more or less plateau there after roughly the age of 70. There's a similarity here. And in the data, it's pretty clear that whether it's the earliest farming communities and cities or the largest empires, such as the Han Dynasty, the Qin, or the Western Empire, the key culprit is growing wealth inequality. We have very good evidence, particularly based upon the work of Walter Scheidel, a colleague of mine at Stanford University, that in general, states tend to increase in inequality over time. And this can result in pretty grotesque, enormous levels of inequality. One study of 28 pre-modern states by Branko Milanovic found that on average, there was 77% towards the theoretical maximum level of inequality. That's a situation, that maximum, where one person takes all the surplus wealth and leaves just enough for people to scrape by on and reproduce. In short, they were always increasing in wealth. They got to incredible levels, and we know that wealth has a huge number of negative knock-on effects, ranging from creating more competition between elites through to just being naturally corrosive for people. If we're a species that has been evolved for equality, then it's very difficult for us to live in lopsided societies. In short, in the book, I go through the evidence for all the different impacts inequality has upon a society and show that in a huge number of case studies, this seems to be the key driver of why societies become more vulnerable until eventually they are knocked over by a hazard such as a bout of disease, a plague, a change in the climate, or invaders. And I also show how when we think about the biggest threats we face today, whether it's nuclear weapons or climate change, these two are built upon systems of inequality and extraction.
We are speaking with Luke Kemp, and his book is called Goliath's Curse. I can recall when I was a little kid, the United States celebrating the 200-year mark. And since about that time, it's been growing dramatically more unequal in wealth. How's Goliath doing these days?
Not great. I call this idea of inequality having these knock-on effects that make society more vulnerable, diminishing returns on extraction. That over time, growing wealth inequality and more extractive institutions have diminishing returns. And you see this across the world. It's not just the United States, which is experiencing polarization, democratic backsliding, a drift towards autocracy, growing wealth inequality, regulatory capture by billionaires, a rising far right, a cost of living crisis. Those are all things that apply essentially to the UK, to Australia, to Germany, across the OECD and across much of the world. And that is all the symptoms of growing wealth inequality and diminishing returns on extraction. And it's not just happening to the US, the US is just ahead of the curve. But essentially, we live in a very unique time. In the 1940s and 50s, there was a huge compression of wealth, and we had a few brief decades of wealth equality. Essentially, the world wars both created new taxation conditions where the rich were taxed much more to provide for the war effort. So, for instance, in the US, during the war, the rich, the top income bracket were taxed by roughly 94%. We also had a huge destruction of old money and the rise of course, welfare states and the expansion of the vote. That was not to last. In the 1970s, wealth inequality begins to rise again. In 1980, roughly 25% of global wealth was captured by the 1%. Today, it's 40% or over that. And we see that unfortunately having all these knock-on effects. But in many ways, I'm concerned about diminishing returns on extraction, but it's not my biggest fear. My biggest fear is that inequality is underpinning the construction of threats that could destroy the entire global Goliath. In this case, things like climate change, nuclear weapons, and potentially even advanced AI algorithms. In the book, I go through how each of these are produced just for a very small sliver of institutions and very powerful ones at that. It's not the case that it's human nature driving the construction of these world-ending threats. Instead, it's a very small number of institutions, which I call the agents of doom. If we look at nuclear weapons, 85% of stockpiles held by two countries, Russia and the US, and only about 28 companies are responsible for maintaining and upgrading these weapons. If we look at climate change, then since 2016, I think it's 60 companies responsible for over 80% of emissions. If we look at countries, then roughly 80% of cumulative emissions across world history come from just 10 countries if you count the EU as one. And 25% of those entire quarter comes from just one country, the US. I could go on and on with the statistics, but it's pretty clear that this is all very concentrated. It's concentrated amongst the rich. It's concentrated amongst companies who profit from creating disaster and then tend to try to hide the evidence, as Exxon did with the evidence of climate change back in the 1970s.
We talked earlier about collapse not always being a bad thing, but if the collapse is nuclear or climate destruction or AI attacking humanity, or some people might add disease pandemics into that list, not so easy to make that a good thing. And the kind of lives we lead make it harder for any sort of collapse to be a positive thing these days, right?
Precisely. Collapse has a bright past, but a dark future. And a future collapse is likely to be both global and much more grim. And this is for a few reasons. First of all, we do live in a global Goliath now, rather than a regional empire. While we tend to think of the world as being carved up and shared amongst a couple of different key empires like the US and its NATO allies, China, Russia, when you look at it, they're all very interdependent, interconnected. Global supply chains do pass through China into the US and vice versa. And they all look remarkably similar as well. Out of all the myriad forms and ways you could organize society, Russia, the US, China, and most other countries look pretty similar. All three of those have nuclear weapons. They all have armies which are split into an army, air force, and navy with very steep chains of command. Each of them has a head of state who basically reports to the UN. Each of them is capitalist, even China. And each of them exists in a very interconnected global capitalist system. Each of them relies upon industrialized, globalized supply chains. Each of them have very similar property rights. There's a reason why you can easily transfer money across the world, whether it's into Saudi Arabia, China, or Russia. And that's because they tend to have very similar legal systems based upon either New York state property law or British common law. No matter how you look at it, they're actually all pretty similar because they are part of one global Goliath, which means that if the collapse happens today, it'll be most likely global rather than a kind of local or regional one. And the other fact is states historically have been fairly predatory and extractive, but we have some pretty good states today. Denmark does provide a range of public goods to its people, and in general is pretty accountable to its citizens as well. When Somalia collapsed, it was actually pretty good for its citizens when you look at most quality of life indicators, whether it be infant mortality, which dropped by 24%, or maternal mortality, which dropped by 30%. If Denmark collapsed today, it would be a very different story. So that's another factor. A third is simply that we can't easily return back to hunting and gathering or farming like our ancestors did. And a fourth is that collapse, when it does occur, tends to be accompanied by a spasm of violence as groups of armed young men try to recreate a new Goliath. They try to basically build up a new power structure. And those battles have usually been fought with handheld axes and swords made of bronze or iron, muskets, bows and arrows. Today, we have nuclear weapons and killer robots. The overall situation is one that I refer to in the book as a rungless ladder. That as you build larger, more extractive, and more complex societies which have more captured energy, they also tend to become more the costs of collapse inflate, where suddenly, if you do collapse, it becomes much, much worse for the citizens. And eventually, you can you can build up such a Goliath that eventually a collapse will become terminal. And it's unclear, but we may be reaching that stage insofar as we've used up most of the easily accessible fossil fuel reserves throughout the world. And it's unclear as to whether we could do a second industrial revolution if a collapse did occur.
What can we do? I mean, we see people rise up nonviolently, take over government in South Korea, in Bolivia, in Thailand, in numerous countries in Africa. We don't see it in the United States or Europe. Obviously, we could. There's no rational reason for a major nuclear power not to unilaterally disarm. There's no reason you can't make buckets of money off greener energy systems. There's no reason that we can't stop researching bioweapons. There's no reason you can't ban AI, but it's not happening. What can we do to reduce the risks?
The reason it's not happening is usually hint upon a few different things. One is arms races that unfortunately states are competing, corporations are competing, and they have to always look for a military or strategic advantage. And the second is that there's also a race for resources, that you have to find new resources, you have to kind of lower regulations in order to get an advantage once again. But essentially, the idea is that we're caught in these traps, what some would call game theory, that in order for self-interested actors to win, they enact certain situations where everyone loses out. The problem is that most individuals don't act this way. When you put people into what are called tragedy of the commons situations, so everyone has access to a common pool resource, and everyone's supposed to exploit it to the detriment of everyone collectively, that doesn't actually tend to happen in a laboratory setting. Instead, just letting people communicate tends to result in the tragedy of the commons not occurring. And similarly, people don't tend to end up in things like prisoners' dilemmas or arms races. But we do see that states and corporations often do. And that seems to be because they're representative of the worst of us. Similarly, the people who don't tend to fall into arms races and tragedy of the commons are people high in the dark triad, so Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopathy, and also people who believe in self-fulfilling prophecies, that finance and economics students are much more likely to fall into these traps as well. In the book, I put forward a large number of different recommendations of how we can directly reduce existential risk, but also how we can essentially escape from these races. And this ranges from very particular, precise policies to actually, the very simple things like abolish nuclear weapons as a first step, put stockpiles down to 300. That's kind of the minimum level that's required for deterrence. You don't need 3,000 like the US currently has. Phase out carbon emissions. And think about this not as doing a carbon tax per se, but just making the economy more honest. Every time a fossil fuel company pumps up carbon into the atmosphere, they're enacting a cost. 9 to 12 million people die every year due to carbon emissions, and of course, many more will die in the future due to the impacts of climate change. They don't have to pay for any of those lost lives. If they did, the world would look very different. But ultimately, these things are not going to happen if we don't address arms races. And the way to do that is by essentially escaping Goliath, by reverting back to radical democracy. And I provide a huge number of different examples of how to do that. In particular, making sure that corporations, but also our governments, are run through what are called citizen assemblies and citizens' juries, where you randomly select people from across the population, you have them informed by experts, they deliberate and discuss amongst themselves, and they come to a conclusion, a policy conclusion. And if I may, I'll give one very brief example of why I think this can actually be a really effective way of saving the world. In 1945, the Manhattan Project, the quest to build the first atomic weapon, was concluded with the Trinity test, which was the detonation of the world's first atomic weapon in the sands of New Mexico in 1945. Prior to that detonation, the scientists were taking bets as to whether that would destroy the entire world, because the physicist Edward Teller had made a calculation that there was a non-zero chance that igniting the bomb would ignite the entire atmosphere, killing not just every single human, but every shred of life upon Earth. By that time, the US also knew that the Nazis were no longer building their own weapon, nor were they capable of doing so. They still, of course, went ahead and took the risk. The question I asked in the book, and that I've asked many people, is imagine if you had a citizens' jury, a collection of 12 people, a dozen chosen at randomly across the population, nurses, plumbers, farmers. They were given that information and they had to make a decision. Would they detonate the bomb? I've yet to see anyone who convincingly says yes, they would, because to be frank, they wouldn't. And I think this is very revealing that in general, people tend to be very risk averse and that democracy can save the world. And that's the reason why both fossil fuel companies, nuclear powers, etc., tend to cloak their activities in secrecy because they know that democracy is one of the most effective ways to essentially stop them. And in the book, I put forward a range of measures ranging from radical democracy through to things like having a cap on wealth of $10 million, which essentially makes sure no one gets enough wealth to actually start undermining democracy like we see right now in the US. But the overall image is one simply of slaying Goliath and returning back towards our egalitarian origins.
So most people are much better than our society tells us, and our leaders are much worse than our society tells us. And so one key question is how do we get people to know those facts? And one way would be to read Goliath's Curse. The other question is how do we actually change the structures of government so that we have some power for ordinary people? God, I got a million questions left, but we only have a few minutes. But but this is an important one. How can we actually change to have citizens branches of government? The current governments don't want that.
That's the biggest question. And unfortunately, I'm not a seer. I don't have all the answers, and this is the one I'm probably least equipped to answer. But if we look at history, it is quite clear that two things will likely be necessary. One is relying upon mass mobilization and struggle. In the book, I go through how when we look at it, whether it's human height, real income, so wages essentially, or even human happiness, all these things don't seem to actually increase across the last 5,000 years of history, despite rapid technological change, despite the adoption of windmills, water mills, and iron plows. What does result in people's lives improving dramatically is not actually industrial revolution. To the contrary, the industrial revolution results in people both falling in terms of height and have plummeting life expectancy as well. It's not until you get mass mobilization movements, unions, anarchists, feminists, and many others, all demanding for things like the 40-hour working week, better working conditions, and the expansion of the vote. And of course, even things like the rollout of sanitation, which ends up being by far the biggest benefit to health. So one thing we are going to need in the future is to have more protest and more people in struggle against their governments to do the right thing. In this case, to enact citizen assemblies and juries. The other is probably going to be better use of technology. Right now, we're using most technologies to essentially supercharge mass surveillance in the military when we should be using them to supercharge democracy and freedom. If we put our money where our mouth was, the world looked very different. We would expend at least 100 times more resources and money on things like facial recognition, mass surveillance systems than we do on improving our democracy. We can change that. And if we started to actually try to do democracy at scale using digital technologies and tools, if we approach democracy not as a constitution to be always protected, but as a practice to be improved upon with every generation, we could do some incredible things. And that should be the new imagination we have is not how do we get to Mars, but how do we build the best kinds of democracies representative of their citizens here on Earth?
Sounds very, very good to me. Less than a minute left. Luke Kemp, do you have a website? How can people follow your work or get in touch with you or see what you're up to next?
I have a Blue Sky Mastodon account, both at Luke Kemp. I'll be starting a Substack, which I think is at Luke underscore Kemp, I think. And additionally, I will have a website coming up shortly, which I believe will be www.luke-kemp.com. And apart from that, I'll also be working on putting together hopefully an NGO, which will be trying to give more impetus to this movement towards radical democracy and hopefully starting a broader movement about moving towards radical democracy to save the world.
Sounds wonderful. We've been speaking with Luke Kemp, whose book is called Goliath's Curse. I cannot recommend it highly enough. Get one, read it, get a present for everyone coming holiday season, and you won't be sorry. I highly, highly recommend it. Luke Kemp, thanks for writing the book and for coming on Talk World Radio.
David, it was my absolute pleasure. Thank you.
This is Talk World Radio. I'm David Swanson. Take action at rootsaction.org. Help end war at worldbeyondwar.org. Read or listen to today's Peace Almanac entry at peacealmanac.org. All past shows can be heard at talkworldradio.org. Talk World Radio is produced in Charlottesville, Virginia, and syndicated by Pacifica Network. There is no way to peace. Peace is the way.